Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this so early but so useful and important session on navigating misinformation. My name is Irena Shyroka. I am a president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress of BC Provincial Council, and I'm very pleased to see you today. In today's world, information reaches us faster than we think, and it's not always truthful. Disinformation is deliberately created to mislead, manipulate opinions, divide communities. It can affect everything, from elections and public health to how we perceive global conflicts and our local communities. Our goal in this session is to explore how disinformation works and it spreads, and most importantly, how we can recognize it. We will hear from our extremely experienced experts who will share their insights and their research. We'll hear practical strategies for identifying false narratives and tools to help us all become more discerning consumers of information. We will begin with short presentations for each of our speakers. We will have 20 minutes for their presentation, after which you will have a chance to ask questions and receive answers. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to call to this stage our UCC National Fundraising Coordinator, Lesa Skeva, to introduce and acknowledge our sponsor.
Дякую, Ірино. Добрий ранок, welcome. Everyone's had their coffee this morning. I'm here to talk about the Petro Yatsik Education Foundation. It was established in 1986 by an endowment from a Ukrainian-born Toronto businessman and philanthropist, Petro Yatsik. Petro believed that philanthropy is a driving force behind positive change in society. Prior to establishing the foundation, he undertook, developed, and supported projects in the areas of education, Ukrainian culture, community development, and human rights. Petro Yatsik's efforts have been continued by his daughter, Nadia Yatsik, who since its inception served on the board of directors and in 2001 assumed the role of the foundation's president. One of the primary objectives of the Petro Yatsik Foundation is to sponsor initiatives which contribute to the promotion of international awareness of Ukraine and its people, and to provide the world with objective information about Ukraine's past and present through the establishment of high-level scholarly programs in Ukrainian studies. This information will determine the world's attitude toward Ukraine and Ukrainians. Thank you to the Petro Yatsik Education Foundation for their generous support.
Дякую, Леся, і дякую Petro Yatsik Education Foundation for such a great opportunity for which this Congress is taking place. Okay, I would like to ask you to join me in introducing our fabulous experienced speakers. I'd like to read a short biography of each of them. First, I'd like to start with Alexandra Pavliuc. Please welcome. Alexandra is a researcher at the University of Oxford, where she currently completed her doctoral thesis on Ukrainian digital diplomacy as a countermeasure to Russian propaganda during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. She is also a senior data analyst at Global Affairs Canada, where she leads projects that strengthen information integrity and safeguard democracy. Alexandra has delivered over 140 talks, trainings, and expert briefings in 16 countries on countering disinformation with data science. Her research on state-backed disinformation and countermeasures has been published in top-tier academic journals, as well as by leading think tanks and NGOs. Alongside her PhD, Alexandra also holds her Master's in Data Science from University of London, her Bachelor's in Professional Communication from Toronto Metropolitan University. Please welcome Alexandra. Now I would like to introduce Philip May. Thank you, Philip. Philip May is a senior researcher and co-director of the Social Media Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University and a co-founder of the International Conference on Social Media and Society. His research focuses on social media users and their usage, particularly in the context of disinformation, AI-generated deepfakes, foreign interference, conspiracy theories, online toxicity, and digital political transparency. His work and commentaries are frequently cited in scholarly publications and featured in national and international media outlets. Philip also develops research tools and dashboards, many of which are used by thousands of students and researchers globally to study public disclosure and online participation. The thread that connects all of his work is building tools and platforms that help to make society more transparent. He holds a master's degree in international relations and a Juris Doctorate in international law from Syracuse University. Please welcome Philip. I would like to introduce Justin Ling, who is an award-winning investigative journalist who covers national security, policing, politics, and plenty of other things. He is a contributing columnist to the Toronto Star and a frequent contributor to Foreign Policy and Wired. He has covered the war against Ukraine and the threat of Russian disinformation for the past decade. His newsletter, Bug-Eyed and Shameless, is all about information warfare. Please welcome Justin. And last but not least, Anatoliy Grudz. Thank you, Anatoly. He is a professor at the Ted Rogers School of Management and the director of research at the Social Media Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University. As a computational social science researcher, he investigates how social media transforms how people and organizations communicate, collaborate, and share information and disinformation. His expertise lies in studying online communities and social networks and developing new computational methods and tools to analyze public discourse across various domains. Most recently, he has been examining the spread of pro-Kremlin narratives, propaganda, and disinformation related to the Russia-Ukraine war. Anatoly's innovative approach to studying social media has led him to be named a Canada Research Chair in 2015 and inducted into the Royal Society of Canada College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists in 2017. Please welcome Anatoly. All right, I think that's enough of reading. We can just dive in directly to our questions here. And my first question would be to Alexandra. Alexandra, can you please tell us what are the most common forms of disinformation you encounter in your field, and how can individuals distinguish them or recognize them? You can use the stage for your presentation, and after Alexandra's presentation, we can all ask your questions using the mics in the hall. Please.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And of course, thank you so much, Irena, for the very kind introduction. So yes, my name is Alexandra Pavliuc. I'm from Toronto, so I'm very happy to be back here today in my community. I've been away for 7 years doing my studies in the UK, so it's always nice to come back. So my presentation is titled Navigating Disinformation, Countermeasures, and the Role of Community Advocacy. For almost a decade, I've been studying Russian disinformation, the tactics that are used, the strategies that are used. But something I really believe in and have focused my research on is looking at both sides of the coin. So the disinformation tactics, but also the strategies to counter it, the countermeasures. So I hope to introduce both of those elements into my talk today, as well as some reflections on the role of community advocacy. I want to also broaden the way that we think about disinformation. So I appreciate the definition, of course, that's been said, but really that disinformation is that purposeful use of false information to deliberately deceive. But this is one type of harm in a larger body of online harms. When we think about Russia's tactics to influence anyone of anything, really, their aims are to influence, to divide, and to control. More broadly, what they're doing is really running malign influence efforts and campaigns. And what these are is purposeful efforts to skew how people see the world. Part of that is disinformation, but it can also be the use of truthful information that is maybe critical of the person or entity that they're trying to target, but spreading it in an untruthful way. Typically, known example could be a bot farm of lots and lots of fake accounts spreading critical information about one person to try to skew the way that people view that individual. So as I get into my presentation, I'm not just speaking about disinformation, but broadly more these efforts of malign influence. Beautiful. So first, I'll go over the case study of my PhD research. I promise I will not dive into the nitty-gritty methods and details for this audience today, but I'm really going to be showing some of the key forms of Russian disinformation in terms of the narratives that they use, and then actually the really core of my research, which has been around the Ukrainian counter-narratives and countermeasures that have been deployed. Also, of course, for this group, as we try to think of new and innovative ideas together to counter Russian malign influence in Canada and globally, I want to give a few examples of global advocacy and community responses to disinformation that I find really interesting from around the world that I hope we can glean some ideas from. And then finally, some further reflections and recommendations. So again, as I mentioned in my introduction, really the information war that we're in today that goes beyond the borders of Russia's physical war against Ukraine, it has two sides. The first piece is that Russia and other foreign malign actors use digital technologies to engage in online influence and disinformation in order to shape the behaviors of others. So their objectives are to influence the beliefs of others, the actions of others, etc., to polarize communities and to sow distrust towards people who are associated with democracies and entities. So that's one side of the coin. But then the other side is that democracies, but in this section with my research, is that Ukrainians, of course, are employing countermeasures against Russian propaganda during war. So I really look at both sides of the coin. And it's really important too, because of, maybe you know, but this year the World Economic Forum named disinformation among the top threats, top global risks. And there's also more research coming out about how foreign information operations are trying to manipulate social media to influence our views. And I'm sure my fellow panelists will have lots of examples of that as well. But then looking at the other side of the coin, there's this new kind of emerging space of researching different types of countermeasures. One, of course, being media literacy. So Finland is known for kind of, according to CNN, winning the war on fake news because they are running media literacy education for youth, adults, and the elderly. But then there's also strategies. So pre-bunking, for example, is a way to try to build resilience against online misinformation, to explain the tactics used by Russia and other malign actors before they actually do them, so that an audience understands how they're going to be targeted. And then when they see it happen, they already have that defense against it. So just as two examples, again, of the importance of different types of countermeasures. So broadly, there is research on which countermeasures, which types of countermeasures should be approached and used. So on the left, or in the center, that center column, I think these are the ones I'm focusing on in my presentation, and I think they're ones that we can learn from as a community. So these are different forms of public information. The first is, of course, supporting local journalism. Second is media literacy education. Third is fact-checking. Fourth is labeling social media content. Admittedly, that one I'm not talking about today. And then the fifth, which I will start with, is using counter-messaging strategies. So this is where you take the key narratives spread by a malign actor and craft narratives that counter those. Not just tit for tat, where let's say Russia says one really specific fake narrative about Ukraine, and then Ukraine says a really specific we didn't do that, but kind of on a higher level, and I'll give my examples shortly. Then there's also lots of examples of government action and platform action to countering disinformation, but I won't be speaking about those today. I want to emphasize that there is no one silver bullet policy option to countering disinformation and a malign influence. It requires different people and communities in different sectors to either work together or at least in their own space work to use some of these countermeasures within their own community, because if everyone uses the countermeasure that works best within their community, then broadly the ability to counter disinformation and increase resilience to it will increase across the board. So really a portfolio approach of, combining different things like media literacy education with fact-checking, which is an example I'll talk about shortly. So on to the whistle-stop tour of the last 5 years of my life after having to, leave Toronto and Plast and Ukrainsky Tansi to move to the UK. Very rainy, very dreary. But, over the last 5 years that I've been studying this topic, the key question that I've asked in my research is, how do men and women, Ukrainian politicians, produce narratives that counter Russian propaganda during war? Before the start of the full-scale invasion, I had already started my PhD, and my intent was actually to study Russian disinformation, particularly targeted at women in Ukraine. But after the start of the full-scale invasion, it was clear to me that, of course, there's already lots of research on Russian disinformation, but it's so important to document and learn from the strategies that, in this case, Ukrainian politicians have been doing to counter Russian disinformation. There's, of course, lots of other groups in Ukraine and outside of it that have their own strategies, but turns out you have to get quite specific with PhD research, so this was the direction that I went in. So what did I do? Very briefly, I collected tweets and Facebook posts from all Ukrainian politicians during the first year of Russia's full-scale invasion. And I also collected all tweets and Facebook posts from all of the accounts that they targeted more than 10 times during that year. So what that ended up being was European, North American allies and leaders. So my research really looked at what were the Ukrainians saying, but also which narratives stuck. Where was their convergence with those Western allies? The place I found most convergence was around diplomatic narratives, so speaking about the value of diplomacy and the value of working together. But a broader piece that I looked at was, how did the specific narratives from Ukrainians work to counter really high-level Russian propagandistic narratives? So you can read my whole 400-page PhD, but don't worry, there's just this one slide that I'm going to use today to talk about that question that's been asked, which is, what are those forms of Russian propaganda? And then I want to talk about the Ukrainian counter-narratives. So I'm going to go through them one by one. Firstly, very commonly, Russia calls itself the victim. This is a tactic to distract from the true, credible information that, of course, it is the aggressor. So Ukrainian men and women actually had slightly different strategies to counter this narrative. Ukrainian men politicians did directly counter it and say that Russia is the aggressor state. That was a very common narrative that they used during the first year of the war, the full-scale war. But Ukrainian women politicians took a slightly different approach, which was that Ukrainian civilians' lives are shattered by Russia as their sort of way to counter that narrative that Russia is the victim. Second narrative from Russia, and these on the left are summarized from really in-depth research from other experts on Russian disinformation narratives. The second is that West is the aggressor, and Ukraine's kind of counter-narrative again is really that Russia is in fact the aggressor state. The third one that you've probably heard that's very common is calling Ukrainians Nazis. And given, of course, the atrocities committed by Nazis, Ukrainians really, I think, were countering that by again saying that Ukrainian civilians' lives are the ones that were shattered by Russia. The next one is a really high-level one, the claim that Ukrainians are one people with Russia. This has come forward in a lot of Putin's speeches over the years and by other key figures. Really, every single narrative that's high-level here that projects Ukrainian unity and strength and speaks about Ukraine, I would argue, is working to counter that narrative. So this is where kind of a big portfolio of narratives comes through to counter it. The next is that Ukrainian unity and military are weak, which is a key Russian one. And then here we have two, one that the Ukrainian military is strong by men, and then also by both that Ukrainian and global unity will win the war. So trying to maintain optimism in their messaging so that Western allies see that optimism and agree with it and continue supporting Ukraine. And then finally, not actually targeting Ukraine, but targeting the West and claiming that they are failing. Again, that narrative about global unity, and then that Ukraine needs more international support against Russia. So what do I think we can learn from these different narratives? I think broadly, it's about making sure that we are not going down to the level of specific pieces of disinformation that Russia spreads. Fact-checking is really important, but it ends up becoming a kind of downward spiral of effort where the more disinformation narratives that Russia puts out, when you're trying to counter very specific ones, it just becomes way too much effort for communities like ours to actually do. So I encourage us to, community leaders and organizations, to really maintain that high level of aligning with Ukraine's kind of key narratives about, of course, about Russia being the aggressor state, optimism about global unity, and of course, calling for more support of Ukraine. So briefly, I also want to speak about a few examples of global advocacy and community responses to disinformation that I find really interesting and that I think that we can learn from. So firstly is journalist exchanges. There's been lots of countries that have been sending their own journalists to Ukraine, and then then the Ukrainian journalists go back to those countries. So I want to just put one out here, which is an example of Germany and Ukraine. And it was about 15 journalists from each country went to the other country. And this is really how we can ensure that it is trusted voices that are sharing Ukraine's message, that are more diverse and go beyond just, Ukrainian figures, Ukrainian leaders, Ukrainian people spreading their own message. It's more effective when there are trusted voices using trusted channels, communicating the atrocities of the war, and exchanges like these are one example. So, what we can learn is that it can foster international coverage of the Ukrainian struggle and Ukrainian voices. And for a relatively small investment, there could be a big impact with the amount of news articles published. So more broadly, what I think we can learn is about trying to help facilitate those ties where it's possible, potentially between journalists and individuals in Canada and with Ukraine. So the second is I think is quite cool. It was an event a couple of years ago supporting the Together We Rise Grain from Ukraine initiative that was run by the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And what happened was there was an event organized at a Kenyan cafe, a local Kenyan cafe in Nairobi, to promote how much Ukraine contributes to food security around the world. So here it's really interesting because it's a very creative and, quite small scale endeavor of an event at a local cafe, but it got a lot of news coverage, broadening its reach. And I think there's a lot that we can learn here. And this is an example of a counter messaging strategy. So communicating how much Ukraine impacts global food security. It's about target audience awareness. So if you're trying to influence, people in a certain country, you need to meet them where they are, in this case, in a local cafe. It also used trusted voices and channels where it was communicated by people's local community members within that cafe. And again, broadly promoting Ukrainian messages, in this case, about the importance of Ukraine to global food security. And then finally, I wanted to give one non-Ukrainian example, which is actually a community-led fact-checking initiative during the last election in Taiwan. So essentially what happened was kind of civil society tech organizations partnered with educational organizations and community groups to first run trainings on how to do fact-checking and how to research disinformation, in this case coming from China, and then also to publish those fact checks so that the country at large can learn from what is being said during the election. So here's this combination of media literacy education by educating people how to spot disinformation, and then also those community members who took those trainings actually participated during the election to do the fact checks, because they, of course, understand their community and the nuances of how they could be targeted with disinformation. And I think it's a really good example of what we call the whole of society approach, where you have different types of groups coming together to coordinate to counter disinformation. So finally, a few reflections and recommendations. So broadly, again, for that question of what really are the forms of Russian disinformation, to emphasize based on my research, Russia tries to divide populations, right? They try to polarize. This is something that they've been doing for a long time, where they don't just spread one disinformation narrative, they'll spread multiples that say the exact opposite thing and completely do not work together. But because they spread it to different target audiences, they're trying to divide and polarize. When they need to, when they're targeting individual people, they will also try to dehumanize and delegitimize opponents. I think calling Ukrainians Nazis, of course, is also a form of dehumanization, because it tries to bring them down to that level and decrease people's interest in supporting a group that are called that horrible term. And also Russia tries to divert attention away from its own atrocities by shifting blame. So again, by calling Ukraine the aggressor or the West the aggressor. So a few recommendations. So firstly, spotting and countering disinformation can be a community-led practice. It can be something that's organized here and then spread to other communities outside, of course, of the Ukrainian community. Second is that partnering with trusted voices and trusted channels of target audiences can improve reception. So that idea of journalistic exchanges just being one idea there. And then also media literacy really has many forms. And that, of course, starts with better news coverage. So again, that idea of journalistic exchanges of disinformation, trainings for journalists to be able to recognize disinformation and report on it, to implementing youth and adult media literacy education either in schools or after-school programs, etc. So I hope that that has been useful, and I'm very, very happy to answer any questions. And I also look forward to the discussion with my co-panelists afterwards. Дякую.
Дякую, Alexandra. Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, please use the mics in the hall. Sorry, it's really hard to... Yeah, there are 2 mics over here. We have one question coming up.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very, very useful and very helpful. A couple of thoughts, questions really. How effective are these community-led advocacy interventions? What data do you have on which are more effective than others? And please don't go into the election-associated ones, all right? We know about those. But at the community level, which ones are effective? And secondly, with social media companies not being responsible to any authority, including any government authority, how can communities deal with the algorithms that the social media companies keep using? So those 2 issues, please.
Thank you. Those are really good questions.
Thank you so much. I think to answer a bit more broadly on the first one, we need to think about what our target audience is for our community-led efforts. If it's to educate our specific community, that can be measurable because we are not a small one, but we can communicate with our own group. Essentially, there's different, sorry. I think it's, when we look at effectiveness and impact, generally it is very difficult to measure, but with running interviews and speaking to the members that we're trying to communicate with, it could be looking at how many news articles have been published about the issue or the topic at hand is another potential way to measure the effectiveness. But these do end up being proxy measurements, because when you're trying to change beliefs and behavior, the best you can do is survey someone and ask them the question of if they've actually changed their mind. But depending on the specific effort, there's different methods to measure the effectiveness, again, whether it is those specific questions or looking at how many articles have been posted about a topic, etc. So with social media platforms, it is, of course, it's difficult to get at them and explain to them that there's been, for example, disinformation spreading about a community, etc. And how can communities potentially impact that? I think there's a level of knowledge within the community that needs to be had on the terms of service of social media platforms, specific ones, because they're not going to do anything unless, if anything, unless their terms of service are actually broken. So if it's a community-led effort to look for disinformation during a certain event or around a certain person, if it gets to the point where it's breaking terms of service, which does require quite in-depth research, that is the way that then a community can advocate to a social media platform to, for example, take down content. So it gets a little bit more technical and in-depth, but I think from what I've seen, that's the key pathway towards influencing a social media platform to take down content that's being spread. And it does require a level of research, but it isn't impossible, but it is, of course, it requires a bit more in-depth research.
Perfect. Thank you, Alexandra. Are there any more questions? Yes, there is one last question that we can take.
Okay, sorry, I don't want to be super negative, but it is difficult right now because it seems to me that even when people are presented with the truth, factual evidence of things, they refuse to change their minds. And I mean, we have examples of that everywhere. So it's not only trying to educate people, but once they know what the truth is, they don't want to be influenced into believing, what we're presenting as evidence. So that's just my question.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and I think it goes back to there not being a silver bullet to countering disinformation, so I completely agree with you. And I think that's where it comes into, it's a coordinated very in-depth effort on the side of Russia. There's people who are, their whole career is in political technology to learn how to run influence campaigns, spread propaganda. They'll learn about specific target audiences, they'll learn their language, and then their whole career can be trying to influence them to agree with the Russian perspective. So I completely agree with you, and it is such a, it's a very long process to try to unravel that, but that's where, again, looking at different methods of which, you know, start with really high quality journalism that does uncover these issues. And I think that's also where, you know, another tactic I didn't really talk about, but it was in one of my early slides, is this strategy of pre-bunking. It's something that's being researched right now where scholars essentially compare, you know, vaccinating people against a disease or a virus, to vaccinate them against the strategies used against them. So that, for example, an education campaign can say that Russia may try to target people during an election period by, you know, using a certain tactic. By explaining that first, that might help people then recognize it, so they feel like they've gained new information and have learned something, and then they feel smart when they actually see the thing come forward, and they think, haha, I was right, I learned about that, I get it. And just that's another tactic. So I want to just emphasize, I completely agree with you. Not a single one of the things I've spoken about is the silver bullet to fixing this problem, but really it's about, you know, using whichever methods work best for a community to target a certain target audience, and trying to use more than one, because none of them are silver bullets. So I feel your pain. I'm trying to dedicate my life to this, and it's really quite, it's a lot of different things to learn, different tactics, and really thinking about target audiences and what's possible.
Дякую, Alexandra. I think we have a very, very short last under 1 minute question. Please.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Very interesting stuff. My question revolves around the cosmopolitan makeup of Ukraine as a place of refuge. Compared to the Nazi narrative, for example. You have many indigenous peoples of Ukraine, like everybody from the Krimchuks, the Tartars, everybody, rabbis manning post. It's a cosmopolitan and also a place of refuge. Even Lapis Trubetskoy from Belarus, for example, championed the Maidan and such. Perhaps you could comment on that kind of positive narrative for Ukraine.
Yep.
As well as the captive nations narrative for us to use against the Russians. Thank you.
Which narrative? Sorry, I misheard the last piece.
Captive nations of Russia?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that is a very, very good question and point, and that comes back to a different strategy that is what I essentially am looking at, which again is that counter-brand strategy. So, you know, Ukraine has had lots of different kind of smaller campaigns to counter that narrative. One, promoting the fact that the president is Jewish, promoting the religious diversity within Ukraine. Another one that I've looked at really closely is also promoting how many women are actually in the army, also in upfront roles. So Ukraine using its diversity and sharing stories of its diversity can in fact be a shield against that specific narrative that tries to paint all Ukrainians as one picture and try to dehumanize them. So because when Russia uses narratives that aim to dehumanize Ukrainians, what they're in fact trying to do is desensitize their own population and global populations from caring when Ukrainians are killed on the battlefield. So I really appreciate your question, because it's really what I'm trying to look at is, again, Ukraine using its diversity as its strength. And that's where, you know, it's not about kind of debunking the specific narrative, no, we're not Nazis. It's about saying, actually, what we're going to refocus on which is the truth, is that diversity, is the women in the army, the religious diversity, et cetera. So yeah, really appreciate that. And I think, yeah, just to comment on Russian audiences, I think, again, when Russia is trying to dehumanize Ukrainians, that's also a message towards their own population to not rise against it, essentially, one of many. Thank you. Yeah, do you mind elaborating on that?
Yeah, the captivations of Russia, like there's a disproportionate number of Buryats and Yakuts that are being killed on the front lines.
For sure.
And they're basically siphoning Siberia people.
Yes. Yeah.
As a counter narrative or a counter strategy against the Russians.
Yes, absolutely. That's another piece. Russia is also a diverse nation. Balkanize it would be nice to split them all up. But yeah, so with that, of course, it is a lot of the diverse people, like the not kind of ethnic Russians who are being killed on the front lines. And that's another thing that's worth emphasizing. I think I've been also reading up on attempts at explaining this and communicating this within the Russian population. Of course, you can't just talk about it because it's going to be censored. I was reading about one of the ways that Russian exiled journalists actually are trying to communicate back into their country is really just by speaking about the death tolls, like at least asking questions about that and trying to communicate about that. This is journalists who've left the country. As one attempt to try to pick at that really to try to pick at the kind of disproportionate amount of people being conscripted who are from different minorities within the country. Absolutely.
Yes, дякую. Thank you very much, Alexandra. It was very extensive and useful presentation and answers. And now I would like to invite Philip and Anatoly to present their joint research presentation. After answering one of my questions, Philip, actually, as an organization leader, it's actually very, the question is very high interest of me. How can community leaders and organizations, how can they effectively respond to false narratives being spread online?
Well, thank you for having me this morning. To address that question, because the communities is wide and large, and there's different aspect of a community, so it's difficult to answer that question specifically. So what we usually advise when government asks us the same question is, we ask each community look and identify members of the community that might be more vulnerable than others, and find out what it is that they need and provide them with that resource. Because try to do a blanket presentation or advice to cover everybody in your community is going to be very difficult. But there are certain members of your community that are more likely to be targeted than others. Find out who those are, and then find out what they need, and then provide them with that help. So this way, if they are being targeted, your help is also being targeted, right? The help that you want to provide. This is something that will take a little bit more effort, but once you identify them, this way, those particular people in your organization, who's, let's say, the communication person, or who is the one that's traveling to Ukraine often and is more public, they're more likely to be targeted than others.
Yes, thank you so much. Can we just get have our presentation on the screen?
Sure.
Yes, thank you so much.
Again, thank you for having me here. My presentation this morning and Anatoly's is a little bit more wonky, so it's not as broad as Alexa's presentation. We're looking more at a particular case study that we recently just completed at the lab and just published. One of the things that we noticed is that a lot of people are using Telegram in Ukraine to get the information about the war. So Anatoliy and I were sitting at the lab one day and we're like, well, who are the people on Telegram, spearheading the conversation and steering the conversation? Who are these accounts that have appeared recently, just in the last 3 years? Some of these accounts literally, didn't exist. And we wanted to know who are they, who's behind them, what are they talking about, who are they referencing, who are they citing in their posts to other people. And so, but to get into that study a little bit, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our lab so that you know where we're coming from and the expertise behind that we have to be able to do this kind of computational social science studies where we're catching, millions of posts and trying to make sense of that. In the old days, we would hire an army of assistants in the lab who would then read a sample of these posts. We now have technology that allows us to basically use AI to basically summarize and pull topics out of these conversations. So I'm going to go into that a little bit, and Anatoliy will go into that in more details. So a little bit about our lab. We're part of Toronto Metropolitan University. We started the lab about 15 years ago. We're a multidisciplinary lab that basically look at how people connect online, how the technology that they use shape the conversation that they have or can have online. Earlier, a question was asked about algorithm and how they help to basically steer our attention. And that's a thing that we look at a lot at the lab. The other thing that we do is, over the last 15 years, we started publishing a lot of reports, looking at how Canadians are using social media online, how new technologies like generative AI, for example, is affecting Canadians and whether they're using it, because we want to take a snapshot in time when new technology comes on to see where people are at, how they're using them. So as you can see, over the years, we've looked at everything from how people use social media to more recently how they're adapting and adopting generative AI in their daily life. We also done a lot of misinformation research, like for example, during COVID, we worked with the World Health Organization to examine the spread of COVID misinformation and how to counter that. And when the war happened, we set up a dashboard that tracks fact checks involving the Russia-Ukraine war overnight. Because we knew from our experience with COVID that as soon as the war started, there's going to be a lot of lies and misinformation spreading about it, and we wanted to create a tool that allowed people to have a central place where they can find all fact checks by professional fact checkers around the world that involve Russia-Ukraine. For any researcher that might be in the room, the other thing that we're known for is that we develop a lot of software that allows researchers to collect data to do their own studies. And then we make dashboards like the deepfakes tracker. So every time a fact checker at any news organization anywhere in the world fact check anything involving a deepfake, we pull it into our dashboard. You don't have to go to Reuters, you don't have to go to AFP to find out, hey, did you guys check anything involving deepfakes today, this week, this month? We will pull that in. Every morning, you can just open up the dashboard and you can see the latest fact checks involving deepfakes from around the world. The dashboard that many of you in this room might be interested in is the conflictmisinfo.org. That's the one that Anatoliy and I built overnight, literally the day the invasion was announced, where we use the same technology to track COVID information to also track fact checks involving the Russia-Ukraine war. So again, any news organization making any fact check that involves or mention Ukraine, mention the war, it will be in our dashboard every morning. And Poly Dashboard is another dashboard that we make that track political ads, how different political parties and different actors in Canada and around the world are using Facebook ads, using Instagram ads to push their agenda. So that dashboard, like I said, tracks the ads and how they're used to push social issues in different countries. So we have one for Canada and most countries in the EU. Over the last few years, we've been focusing a lot on Russian-Ukraine misinformation. So many of our studies in the last 3 years have been focusing on that. So for example, in 2024, we were looking at how Canadians, which of the narratives that are being pushed by the Russian government is floating around in Canada, and which of those narratives Canadians believe. Because again, government have limited resources. They can't be chasing down every rumors, every piece of misinformation and push back against it. So the idea behind this study was to find out, okay, of the 10 or 12 or main narratives, what are the ones that are gaining traction? Which one do Canadians believe? Because that report can then be used by different government agencies to say, okay, those are the ones that we need to spend money and effort to counter, because those are the ones that Canadians tend to believe. So if you're interested, the QR code is there. And then we also look at the anti-refugee discourse. During the first few months of the war, there were a lot of refugees leaving Ukraine. And so there was a lot of propaganda and misinformation around that time against refugees as they were leaving, basically trying to convince the world that the people didn't need help and that they didn't deserve the help. So we want to, again, map out what are those narratives that the Russians are using to basically convince the world not to support Ukrainian refugees, not to provide the aid, not to provide the help. So if you're interested in that study, that's there too. And lastly, we also wanted to know whether, those blur screens and footnotes that the social media company use in on their platform, whether it's helpful or whether it's a Band-Aid where they are going to Parliament and they're going to Congress and saying, see, we have a solution for misinformation. But most of the studies that they do on the effectiveness of things like blur screens and footnotes are internal reports. They don't share that with the public. So what we want to do is have an independent study where we can look at to see whether, do the footnote helps? Do the blur screen help? Because right now there's a move to AI and using AI and firing all the fact checkers. And what our study shows that it does help. Having fact checkers who provide the fact checks that can then be used for footnotes, that can be used to put on blur screen, it does reduce the number of interaction that people have. What we did was we recruited 1,500 Canadians, and then we divided them into 3 groups. One where basically they went through a simulated Facebook timeline. So we made basically a fake Facebook-like timeline. We put in posts related to Ukraine-related content, and then we randomly insert things like footnotes and blur screen, and we want to see, does it help? Does it reduce the interaction? And you know what? It does. So that's a little bit about our lab. We do research, we train, we develop, and we organize events and attend workshops like this to educate the public. But the study that Anatoliy and I want to present to you this morning is something that we just recently published in the last few months. It's looking at the role of English language, specifically verified Telegram channels, in framing the narratives around the Russian-Ukraine war. Because we want to understand who is helping to shape the conversation about the war to English audience. Because there is basically a new industry that has just cropped up of people that, we didn't know who they were 3 or 4 years ago, but now they have an audience. They build an audience using this platform, Telegram. And we want to know, who are these people? What are they talking about? And who are they referencing? So, and specifically, like I said, we want to focus on the English verified channels on Telegram, because obviously they're not speaking to the Russian audience, because otherwise they would be speaking and posting in Russian. Obviously, this is being used to project propaganda, project narratives to a wider Western audience. That's why they're doing it in English. And the other thing we wanted to look at is what topics, along with talking about the war, what other topics are they interested in? What other topics do they talk about when they're online? And as I mentioned before, Telegram has been popular, but it was popular mostly in the Slavic-speaking part of the world and in the Middle East. But after the war, it became more popular. More Ukrainians turned to it, and more people in the West became aware of it. Most of the people, until that point in the West, that used Telegrams were people who basically left Twitter when they were banned by the original owner of Twitter, not by Elon, but by the original owner of Twitter, because they were mostly right-wing, neo-Nazi types, and their content was not allowed on the original Twitter. and that many of them ran to Telegram because it's not as well moderated and as some of the more Western platforms. So they felt like they had more freedom of speech to spew whatever they are trying to sell. So, again, it's very similar to Twitter or X right now. It's structures into groups like channels and supergroups. So think of channels as Facebook pages where basically there's an owner of a page that's basically pushing out content to a larger audience versus groups or supergroups, which are more like regular groups where all the members have the right to share information and have a discussion. So it's less of a broadcast and more of a group discussion. So that's a little bit about Telegram. So I'm going to talk a little bit about data collection and network generation, and then Anatoliy will take over and share with you some of the findings and the details. And I think some of you in this room will find it very interesting because you've probably seen some of these channels if you use Telegram as a way to keep up with what's going on. So to collect the posts, we use the Telegram API. The API is just basically a way for the platform to allow researchers like us and developers like us to access the information. For most of you, when you go to Telegram, you get to see the front end, the apps itself, and the posts and the shares and the like and so on. As researcher, we get access to something called the API, which is the back end. It's where the data that you post becomes data points for people like us to study or developers to then develop additional software on top of the Telegram ecosystem. So what we did was we started with 177 channels. We went to and looked at research done by the Ukrainian government where they said, hi, these are the accounts on Telegram that we know is pushing Russian disinformation. So we started with those few accounts. And then we look around to see what other accounts people are mentioning that are prominent, that are talking about the Russian-Ukraine war. So we started out with that list of 177 seed channel. And then we basically capture all of the posts that those 177 channel post. And we want to see what other accounts do they mention? What other accounts do they reference? So we did that iteratively. So with iteration 1, you start with 177. Iteration 2, you find a few more accounts. And once we find new accounts, we add it to our list. And then we started collecting every post that those new accounts collect also. Because the idea is to basically build up this network of all the accounts that are being referenced, that are being mentioned, or being held up as examples of something to be trusted or something to be disregarded, but at least they're mentioned in the network, because we want to know, like I said, who are the players in this network. The reason why we want to build this is that once you have a network structure like this, you can see who is part of a propaganda network, simply because they tend to repost and reshare things. But by mapping it like this, we can see more obviously who's connected to whom, who tend to share whose content, and so on. So here's an example. So Donbas Devuska is an account owned by some woman in New Jersey. She became infamous, or internet infamous, because she was her account was the first one that shared leaked U.S. intelligence information about the war. So she became a big player on Telegram during this period because of that, and she was able to attract a huge audience. So if you take a post like that, what we do as researchers, we take her post, and then we said, okay, which account does she mention or reference? So in this case, it's Rian.ru, which is a news site. So once we discovered that she mentioned that account, we then added to our data set, right? And then we started capturing all of the posts from this new account that we were not aware of, for example. So that's how we use that. This is, like I said, a way to discover the structure of the post over time. So here is an example of a network connection where this account, Donbas Devuska, forwarded, instead of mentioning in another account, she simply forwarded. the reason why we're interested in forwarding type of engagement is that it's a sign of potential coordination, where, hi, I'm going to be putting out some content. You have a large audience. Can you help me share it? Sometimes it's not explicit where they ask them to do that. Sometimes it's because they're part of the same ecosystem, so they see each other's content, and if it helps them to push their own narrative, they will share it. But by mapping it out, we can see who's consumed who content, who is passing on whose content. So as I mentioned before, we did this 5 times. And the reason why we stopped at the 5th iteration is because by the 5th iteration, we noticed that fewer new accounts were popping into our radar. So if you look at the original first iteration, we started with that 177C channel that we found. And then with the first one, it became 1,702, and so on. In the end, we ended up with 21,907 channels. So as you can see, it's a very rich, dense network of people who are being talked about or are talking about the Russian-Ukraine war. So now I'm going to turn it over to Anatoliy, and I will take questions with Anatoliy at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Yes, thank you, Philip. Just building on, and I got the signal that I have like 5 minutes to wrap it up, so make sure we have time for the rest of the panel. But I want to summarize the actual results. So Philip talked a little bit about our background, what we do, and how we collected this data. And what we're trying to answer here is 2 simple questions that will hopefully inform some of those interventional strategies that Alexa and some of you talked about earlier today. So first question was, what are the verified English-speaking Telegram channels as part of the network? And that's an interesting question because we started data collection from Russian and Ukrainian-speaking channels and groups. So you would not necessarily think there will be a lot of English-speaking channels. On top of that, they're verified. So to get a verified status on Telegram, you have to go through certain steps. You have to be mentioned by Western media, to have a Wikipedia page. So it kind of carries some status to have verification. So as such, if you English-speaking verified channel and somebody reads you, they may perceive your information as more credible than others. And so once we identify what these channels are in this particular network, we wanted to know what topics they cover. And again, that hopefully informs future counter disinformation strategies. So this whole process, the technical process that Philip walked you through, essentially brought us to this like Picasso picture, but it is actual network, and there are thousands of Telegram and groups. So they're like little dots. Those are those Telegram channels, and we're not interested here in a particular single message. It is about information flow, and the colors visually helps us to identify like-minded groups and channels that tend to reshare, recirculate information. And what happens, we usually tend to cross, as humans, cross-verify information. Oh, I saw this message here, and I saw it 10 more times elsewhere. Well, it must be true. Well, this picture tells you that actually, because they are resharing and forwarding each other's messages, you may see the same message many times, but it's just same fabricated, likely fabricated or manipulated piece of content. So if you're following one of the channels in one of the clusters, you're probably exposed just to that particular information, and you're stuck in your echo chamber. So the clusters are numbers. We don't have time to go through each label today. Happy to chat with you after the break, during the break. But the point is that there's only one cluster here out of 14 and largest ones. One is focused on Ukrainian channels and groups, and it's like number 1. It's a link showed on your right side around Zelensky official channel, and there are other Ukrainian channels, but it's a very tiny one, so relatively to the whole information space. So that just tells you one result, that if you're on Telegram and you're following news about Russia-Ukraine war, you're more likely to be exposed to Kremlin-aligned information and misinformation. So regardless where you are in this part of this network. So that's kind of first discovery. The second discovery was really to zoom in on those verified English language channel. What are they doing there? Well, so these are highlighted here in a little bit larger size nodes. Those are 55 channels that were English and verified. And so there were very few Ukrainian ones. again listed on that in the pink color to the right, mostly run by Ukrainian government, but majority of them were really here, the low corner, they're kind of clustered. They are linked to more Russian part of this network. So that tells you that it's either Russian sources using Western media to kind of promote their messaging, and or vice versa. And when it happens vice versa, it's the far-right influencers. A lot of them are pro-Trump far-right influencers in Canada, here, yes, and in the States. So they also align with Kremlin narratives. And the reason we see that, they're clearly part of that information space that connected, linked to Kremlin channels. So this is just some of the categories: the media personalities, political commentators, partisan news outlets. So a lot of them, when we look at the partisanship and credibility rating, they would be on the right side of the political spectrum, and as well as indicating low credibility sources. So when they report something, they don't necessarily link what we would naturally consider as credible sources. And now, when we identify those English verified channels, we want to know what else they're talking about. And then that led us to do this topic analysis that Philip mentioned. So instead of reading every message they posted, and there were 100,000 messages within 1 year period since the full invasion started. So what we did, we ran topic analysis, and it again clustered topics in these kind of bubbles. You see also colorful bubbles. But here, each dot is a message posted by them instead of channels. And there were these are the main topics. So while the Russia-Ukraine war dominated conversation, it was not the main topic for this channel. So it was number 2. Number 1 was really US politics. And here we saw kind of discussions around politics, economical issues, aligned with pro-Kremlin narratives, importantly to say. But also the topics amplified the divisive issues in our societies, LGBT rights, gun violence, inflation. So those are the type of narratives that kind of coexist with pro-Kremlin narratives. So to summarize, essentially, we do see this kind of network of state-affiliated or partisan actors that are sharing often pro-Kremlin aligned narratives. And they share low credibility content. Again, to drive the point, Telegram is not the place for you to learn about news about Ukraine. Whether you're in Ukraine, and I know many, my family in Ukraine, and I know many of them relying on Telegram and such services to get the latest news, but unfortunately it's not the place where you can get credible news. It's contested space, and there are certain partisan actors that push certain narratives, so you really have to be careful and knowledgeable. Future work, we do want to look at also non-verified English channels, like the one Philip mentioned, Donbas Devushka, just one example where you have these non-official actors, but they gaining a lot of followers. And so what are their motivations, and why they are being amplified by other channels? That's a good question for us to examine, as well as non-verified but official Russian diplomatic accounts, which, like this one in Canada, posting very divisive content targeting our population here as well. On this note, I know I was very quick, but if there's any time for Philip and me to answer questions, we will be happy to do so. And while you're thinking about a question, I want to quickly answer the previous question about how community build the algorithm. I love that question, and it's a very well crafted because the platforms indeed are not doing enough. They said we're not in business of fact checking, we're not funding that. So how do we build algorithms? So to build the algorithm, we need to build content first. I was really impressed with Shevchenko's foundation work, especially this morning hearing about it. And in funding museums and other art, cultural events, super important, and we should continue that. But we also should double down on building digital content about Ukraine or about specific events like Russia-Ukraine war, so that our voices are also heard. It's also tied to Alexa's point about contra-narratives. This is where those information battlefields happening, and if we're not there and we're not investing in those spaces, our voices are not heard. And so that's how we build our algorithms, through the content, step 1. Step 2, by partnering with much larger influencers or platforms. There are a few good examples of influencers who are not necessarily have Ukrainian descent, but they are there in Ukraine. They're covering events, they're on Instagram, on TikTok, and they're doing such a great job providing counter-narrative to Russians, but also promoting Ukrainian culture. We need to partner with those influencers who already have platforms. We need to partner with organizations that have platforms. Philip mentioned earlier, we worked with WHO, World Health Organization, during the COVID-19, and there was a huge difference. When our little social media lab puts out an event on Zoom, we have 100 people shows up. When WHO organized the event, there will be thousands of people. So we need to partner that, and that's how we build our own community algorithm that is based on credible news about Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anatoly and Philip, for such a detailed and extensive presentation. If you still have questions after such a detailed presentation, and I see that Pan Petro have a very short, very quick question, because we have, due to a lack of time, we have to move on to our next speaker, but please, Pan Petro.
I'm always short. Thank you so much. I find it very troubling so many Ukrainians use Telegram. As you know, it's owned by a Russian national, Pavel Durov, who's one of the richest men in the world right now. And he was actually arrested on criminal charges in France last year, and that's still pending, for promoting criminal activity on Telegram. Do you have any evidence that he manipulates his platform to work against Ukraine on a disinformation front, particularly with the algorithms? Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of hard evidence, it's hard to get because we don't have the data from the servers. But whether or not there are intended activities, we can see the results of what kind of narratives are dominating the platform. So whether it's done on purpose by the systems design, we do see their pro-Kremlin narratives dominate the platform. They do comply with the Russian government, and there are some Telegram channels that were opposing Kremlin's views or were critical. They were still pro-war, but they were critical of Kremlin, and we saw example how they were taken down by Telegram by request of Russian government. They may deny that, but they are collaborating, at least in that space.
The other thing we have to notice is that the owner is still allowed to come in and out of Russia. And I think you can draw your own conclusion on that.
Perfect, thank you. If that's okay, we can leave our questions to our coffee break, because now I would like to introduce our next and final speaker, Justin. Thank you so much for your patience, Justin. And actually, you can speak to all the questions that you heard today.
Wonderful.
Extension knowledge.
I will. So, Daku, dobry den. That's the extent of my Ukrainian. I apologize. But thank you so much for being here, especially to sit through a lot of, to be here this early in the morning. I understand the Ukrainian vodka was flowing last night. I understand that because I was there. I gave, whatever, that's all right. Listen, for the past decade, I have been covering national security, foreign affairs, and information warfare. I've been doing so, I'm not an academic by any stretch, but I've been doing so on the ground, both here in Canada, in the US, in Riga, Vilnius, and in Kyiv. And I think I've learned some, I hope, pretty valuable lessons about exactly how we do combat misinformation, how we deal with it. And I have a talk that I've been giving for quite some time about how we do fight back, how we can win, how we can be first with the truth, how we can build up systems that prioritize facts. Unfortunately, I've had to update that presentation for our current moment, because I can now, I think, confidently say, with apologies to my co-panelists, we've lost the fight. I know it's not popular to concede defeat in a room full of Ukrainians. I apologize. But the fact is, with the state of where we're at, looking at the faces of the men on that screen, I think we can confidently say the fight against misinformation has been lost. But I'm also here to tell you that's okay. I'm going to explain that over the next couple of minutes, and I hope there will be no tomatoes thrown at me at the end of the speech. So So normally I do a whole song and dance with some peer-reviewed papers, but I don't have an hour for this talk. I only have about 10 minutes. So I'm going to hit you with a couple true things that I think explains why we're at where we're at. Misinformation spreads faster than real information online. It gets shared more widely, and it's often, frankly, more compelling than the truth. Large language models, one of the questions for me was the impact that technology plays on the fight against misinformation and the spread of it. We know now that large language models and AI are prone to hallucinations and have a habit for regurgitating misinformation. But they also help produce misinformation, making it more compelling than human-produced content. They also have drastically reduced the cost and overhead of producing misinformation and have been able to generate it in a variety of different languages at scale for extremely cheap, if not for $0. By that metric, misinformation is increasing. It's accelerating. It's getting bigger and it's getting stickier, and there's really no solution in how to combat that yet. There may never be. The world's largest social media companies have largely given up on combating misinformation and seem to be happy in actively profiting from it. Fact-checking, debunking, pre-bunking, accuracy prompts, and media literacy, some of the strategies talked about by my co-panelists, these are all tools we've developed and prioritized to address the problem. While they initially showed a little bit of promise, we can now say, thanks to some real-world research, they have been somewhere between very modestly effective and not effective at all in combating misinformation. In some cases, they may have actively backfired. That's not to say that there's no value in them, and certainly there's a huge amount of value in studying them, but the fact is, the companies that we rely on to deploy those strategies have largely retreated, given up, or actively worked against these strategies in the real world. On top of that, you've seen an effort by the US government and other states to ban, in some cases to criminalize, these strategies in the real world, making them effectively useless. If you were to design a nexus of intentionally made and distributed disinformation, you would have to include the world's richest man and the social media company he owns, the president of the United States and the government he runs, the most watched TV news station in America, the most popular social media platform in the world, non-state for-profit fraud and hacking groups in Myanmar, North Korea, and elsewhere, state and state-linked agencies in Russia, China, Venezuela, and a host of other countries on top of, well, some other things. And that's without, if it can get worse, it can. That's without counting the companies that merely tolerate the proliferation of misinformation on their platforms, which includes 2 of the 10 richest companies in the world, a whole whack of TV station, online news outlets, and newspapers. So, it sounds pretty depressing. It can get worse. I'm going to quickly focus on a little piece of data here that I find incredibly interesting. There was a study published in the journal Nature late last year that perfectly illustrates something that I've been yammering about for quite a while. People trust in, believe in, share, and reproduce misinformation not just because they're gullible or they're tricked. Those things may be true. But often people produce, share, and repeat misinformation because they have an emotional investment in it. The study found that people, oh, sorry, I'm not advancing my slides at all here. I'm getting really wrapped up. Anyway, this is all right. I'll go back in a second. I'm trying to get through everything really quickly here. So people believe in this misinformation because they have an emotional investment in it. This study looked at the propensity of people to share misinformation based on the emotions it generates. They found that people were actually overall, you can see on this left graph here, people were overall actually pretty good at identifying misinformation. They were pretty good at telling truth from lies. But these researchers found that if the misinformation provoked strong emotions, particularly if it was rage-inducing, people were measurably, somewhere between 30 and 60%, more likely to share it. The misinformation peddlers, knowingly or not, have exploited this fact to fantastic ends. I'm going to give you a real-world example here because I think it helps illustrate some of these trends. Does anyone know who this is? His name is Mike Benz. Familiar to anybody here? Maybe the senator, maybe almost nobody else? I'm not surprised. This guy is arguably one of the most important influencers in Trump's MAGA movement. He is one of the most important anti-Ukrainian propagandists in America. The conspiracy theories he believes, or at least which he regurgitates, are not that interesting. They'll sound really familiar to all of you. You know, Viktor Yanukovych was a wonderful guy. He was Ukraine's legitimate president. He was overthrown in a coup. Russian speakers in Eastern Europe and the Baltics are being unjustly persecuted. Neoconservatives want war in Ukraine for their own ends. Vladimir Putin wants peace, yada, yada, yada. All the stuff you've heard before. But what Benz is particularly good at is telling a story where these lies invoke emotion. He spins it all in a tale of government corruption and censorship of conservative voices. He wraps it all in talk of real American values and stories about how they are lying to you, how they think you're stupid. His narratives are also devised to explain why Trump was right about everything, about why he's been frustrated from succeeding, and about why patriots can rally to about how patriots can rally to his cause. He built an audience of more than 1 million people who want to hear this. More importantly, he's been picked up by the disinformation system. His fans include Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, Tucker Carlson, and some very, very important people in the White House. Benz, probably more than anybody else, is responsible for the total destruction of USAID, the world's most critical and generous foreign aid vehicle. He also had a hand in convincing Trump to pause foreign aid to Ukraine, and he may succeed in doing that again. Most of Trump's fans now believe in and repeat these narratives, developed by Benz and others over the past few years, even if they don't know the name of these propagandists, because they have an emotional and nationalistic interest in doing so. Like voters in the Soviet Union who would trudge to the polls to elect their member of the Congress of People's Deputies, the misinformation becomes a function of belonging to this movement. Said another way, misinformation is not about pieces of information, it's about a system of values. We could tomorrow nuke all the misinformation on the internet. We could blanket the earth in advertisements warning of misinformation's corrosive effects. We could criminalize it and mandate that social media companies take lies offline. It wouldn't work. Bad actors would generate new misinformation and their fellow travelers would repeat it. The advertising campaign would become proof of the conspiracy. New social media companies would spring up to defy these orders and exist as a home for this misinformation. Just to be very clear, we did this. This is our fault. We spent a generation uploading our politics, our media, and our national discourse to the internet, then allowing a small cadre of incredibly powerful and morally bankrupt corporations to take control of it. This isn't to say that our recent strategies, including some of those mentioned today, can't work. It's that we're too late to put them into effect. The opponents of these strategies, the opponents of the truth, those who benefit from misinformation, like Donald Trump, like Viktor Orban, like Robert Fico, like others, have succeeded. They've already seized the means of power, and they're already interested in preventing strategies that will stop the misinformation from which they benefit. Okay. That is the end of the depressing part. I know there's a lot of it. But once you realize all of this, once you accept this, it's kind of liberating. Because to my mind, there may be some disagreement, and that's totally fine. Panels are fun when people disagree. It frees us up from continuing to fight these losing battles. Truth cannot win on Facebook, Twitter, or TikTok, at least not as they exist right now, any more than the truth can win on Fox News or VKontakte, because the game is rigged. If we want to win the next battle, particularly in the English-speaking West, and I should say, a lot of my remarks here are limited to the English-speaking West. The Finns may have success in winning in Finnish. I think the Ukrainians have already had success in winning in Ukrainian. But those of us who speak English, the battle's already been lost. But if we do want to win the next fight, it needs to be with real high-quality journalism that speaks to people's values and emotions. We need more outlets like the Kyiv Independent or Tim Mack's The Counteroffensive. We need to get people reading them, most importantly. We need to offer an alternative to rage. We need to compete, not defeat, misinformation, because there is no defeating it. There's only being better than it. We need to recognize that we're an online species now, for good or for bad. mostly for bad. We need new online systems that aren't controlled by oligarchs loyal to Tsar Trump. Decentralized, user-controlled platforms which have community-driven interest in combating misinformation are a super effective strategy in building these networks and these communities that still care about the truth. I know this sounds a little pie in the sky, but the reality is many of these networks already exist. Reddit, which is one of the oldest social media networks, has been doing this for years to great success. They've been combating misinformation. They have been encouraging good journalism. They've been having fruitful and thoughtful discussions on their platforms. I'm getting really wrapped up. I'm just forgetting to advance my slides. Other newer platforms like Blue Sky and Mastodon and the protocols on which they exist have also shown a remarkable resilience against misinformation in places where positive discussions can still exist. But fundamentally, there might not be a technological solution to this. We need to get better at having human-to-human conversations about these things. I know I probably don't need to lecture this audience on the idea that there's a phone outside your, that there's a world outside your phones and laptops. But the simple fact is that our politics and our world are increasingly being shaped by people who interpret reality through the internet. We need to unplug them from the system that is making them angry and crazy. The title of this talk is Navigating Disinformation. If I can sum up my rather jam-packed talk into a thesis, it should be this. Rather than charting a course straight for the storm, we should be helping people navigate away from disinformation, not towards it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you. Due to the lack of time, I'm inviting everyone for a coffee break, and you'll be able to ask your questions over the coffee. If you still have any questions, but I see Senator Kuchar, you have a very quick question?
Yes, very quick.
Okay.
Thank you all for wonderful presentations, and Justin for being as provocative as usual. We may have lost at this point, but we haven't lost, period. And I, for one, am wanting to champion the Ukrainian story against Russian disinformation. And if I can ask people to join me in that, please come and talk to me after. But I think you, Justin, pointed on one thing that is really, really important. And that is, and I'm going to quote Janice Sorts, the director of the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, who testified before our Senate committee on the study I started on disinformation. And Justin also testified at that panel. By being on the defense, you cannot win. Someone should tell that to the Edmonton Oilers. But this is so important. By being on the defense, you cannot win. So debunking will never win. Fact-checking will never win. The question is, how can we go on the offense? So I would like to hear from people, how can we go on the offense? I would like to see philanthropic organizations that are from Ukraine and are led by Ukrainians joining together to say, how can we go on the offense on disinformation? That's the question. How do we go on the offense? Connor McDavid, over to you.
Listen, that's exactly the right question, I think. And I think it's the right framing. I mean, that is the question of our time. How do you convince people that there is more value in living in the same shared reality as the rest of us? How can you convince people that you can have thoughtful debate and disagreement and that there can be a multiplicity of voices in this space so long as they're all living in the same shared set of facts, right? I know that sounds a little basic because that's literally the fundamental principles of our society, but the reality is people have rejected that notion. And fundamental to the idea of the Russian fire hose of falsehoods model of disinformation is convincing people to disengage and unplug from that shared set of values, from that shared set of facts, from that shared reality, and to organize themselves in opposition to the system we built. I mean, you can point to no greater example than Trump's MAGA movement as emblematic of that, right? From 2016 onwards, the Russian government has tried really hard to help shape Trump's movement, and Trump has responded in kind by doing exactly their tactics of convincing us all to live in a world of conspiracy theories, of paranoia, of distrust, of antisocial behavior, of anti-cohesion, of anti-facts, of anti-journalism, of anti-elites, of anti-institutions. And it's worked. Trying to get people to care about those things again, to get people to live inside systems that are imperfect, is really hard. But that is the mission, right? Like, that is the thing we've got to do. And if you're trying to do so, and I think this is really central to my talk, if you're trying to do so on Twitter, if you're trying to do so on Telegram, if you're trying to do so on Facebook, then you are really playing into the hand that they want you playing in. Because those systems are Potemkin versions of real society. Those things are fundamentally antisocial. They are organized algorithmically, socially, technologically, fundamentally, to be antisocial, anti-democratic, anti-trust in many ways. And I just really think, in terms of strategies, there's no wrong ideas, there's no bad ideas, as long as they're not playing in the sandbox that the oligarchs and Trump and Putin want us playing in.
Yes, thank you, Justin. And I see Pan Mirko has a very final last question.
Okay, thank you. This question is actually to all four panelists. And as it turns out, I think it builds on what Senator Kuchar just said. I believe it was George Orwell that said that who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. What Ukrainians are seeing today is a battle for history. Would you like to discuss that?
Does anyone have any ideas?
Well, listen, I'll really, really quickly say, yes, I could not agree more. I mean, there's been some, and no one is more fascinated with this idea than the Russians themselves, especially those who are not terribly fond of Vladimir Putin. Masha Gessen wrote a whole book. I can't remember the title. The future is the pack, doesn't matter. Wrote a whole book about the shaping of Vladimir Putin's Russia based on exploitation of the past. Figuring out a way to own our past, to be proud of it while also recognizing the problems inherent in it and our own history, I think is really important, and actually one of the most effective narratives. One of the ways in which propagandists and misinformation peddlers have been really good at convincing people to unplug from our media, unplug from our shared democracy, has been to say they want to question, tear up, and denigrate your history. I think we got to figure out a way of engaging on our own kind of shared past in a way that is positive and useful, that is not whitewashing, but that is constructive and community building, and that creates a shared identity for all of the pros and cons of it.
Yes, thank you very much, Justin. Unfortunately, we'll have to cut this session, but I invite you to continue our discussion in the hall over the coffee. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our speakers today for not only sharing your experience, but also for your dedication and your hard work to the topic of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Thank you so much. Thank you for your experience, your wisdom, and good luck. Good luck to all of us. Thank you.